and recipient of the New Zealand Order of Merit. About to attend her tribal annual meeting on the east coast of Aotearoa, New Zealand, Diane was told to bring rainwear and gumboots. The land was deep in silt after damaging cyclones and floods. She was also asked to bring a kete, a basket of knowledge. What's in her kete? Diane trained in landscape architecture, environmental management and mediation. Her PhD is in resource studies. She was a director for the Ministry of Environment, a local government elected representative, and a commissioner for the New Zealand Environment Court. Diane is a past president and secretary general of the International Federation of Landscape Architects, a member of Ngaiaho Maori Designers, and the Ikamos Ifla Cultural Landscape Committee. A director of Land Cult Limited, a slim research consultancy, her main interests are in housing, knowledge transfer and social justice. And she's also done blue water sailing. Thank you, Diane.
Ahi ahi Mārie, everybody. Good afternoon. We have the 2 keynotes from this morning, speakers, and also 3 extra panellists. And if you're wondering about the count, we also have one who unfortunately is still in New Zealand, but is going to join us on Teams. So please remember that she's here and she'll be behind us. Before we start though, I have a couple of little promos. First of all, there is a table that will be passed around, and that is an invitation to anybody who is keen to be part of an Indigenous network. So I wonder if you wouldn't mind, it's already going, yes, if you wouldn't mind filling it in if you're interested. And somebody will be in contact when they've collected them in and give you some options. And the second is, in the true spirit of more promos, to welcome people here to the Indigenous Heritage Program, which is on Tuesday and Wednesday, and on both at the start of the morning, I think, although the program has something different, it will be in the ICC, the IC building, 4.8, C4.8. So, my pleasure to introduce our new people, because the speakers from this morning do not need introduction. So welcome Maina, Talia and Karen. Thank you. And also it's my pleasure to introduce Chrissy Grant. Chrissy is an Eastern Gugu Valangi in Cape York, and Muagai from the Torres Strait Elder, working in international and national level with over 35 years of experience with communities on cultural heritage management and conservation and protection of natural resources. She is now focusing on working across her traditional lands and waters with traditional owners of the Great Barrier Reef and the West Tropics, both World Heritage areas. So a big welcome, Chrissy. And also, and I think behind me, is Sarah Ferguson. She is Ngāti Whakawe and also part of Te Arawa, a larger area, and has been researching local and Indigenous-led solutions for the protection of heritage landscapes and the wider equitable use of these knowledge systems in climate action for her PhD, which she's submitted already, so she's on her way there. Unfortunately, Sarah's not with us in person, but will be on video, and we know she's there. So, welcome, Sarah. And finally, Elizabeth Edwards, welcome. Elizabeth is a Fijian woman hailing from Naikale village. Might have murdered that word, sorry. Toka Toka, Tailevu of the Matagali clan. And her clan name is, take my glasses off, I can't read. Ngata Turanga, nearly. Her Matakali are the traditional Bāti warriors. She is by profession a film producer, editor and communicator. And she's the Secretary General to ICOMOS, ICOMOS Pacifica and Blue Shield Pacifica, and the ICOMOS ISC on intangible cultural heritage. Elizabeth is the Disaster Risk Reduction DRR Program Specialist for UNESCO in Fiji. So again, welcome, Elizabeth. So this will be an opportunity for those of you who still have questions that you wanted answers, but just to start off with, I have some questions as well. So first of all, and any panellist is welcome to answer these, but I'd like to address it first of all to Sarah. I hope she is there. So the question is, what do you see happening to heritage as a consequence of climate change? Where and how are you seeing change in heritage? And how do you understand heritage loss and damage? So, Sarah, did you hear that?
I did, and kia ora everyone. I can't see you, but I'm assuming through the magic of Teams and through the wonderful work of Asmita that you guys can see me. So I will be talking blankly into a screen, but, so if my eyes do wander, I do apologise. But sure, I mean, I can address that. I think there's so many discussion points that can be brought up just from that simple set of questions. I suppose a good place really to start is how do we see loss occurring in climate change is really dependent upon how you're defining climate change, and sort of, itself has been occurring over the past, a couple of 100 years, but we've seen it rapidly increase, particularly in the past 10 to 15 years, and it occurs in many different ways. So we're seeing, from a heritage perspective, I was trained as an archaeologist and went on and did heritage management at UCL. You've got the tangible impacts of heritage in terms of, built heritage and coastline and coastal erosion. In Aotearoa, you've got impact on marae, so coastal marae, encroaching seawater, encroaching tides from king tides and storm surges. You've also got impacts on urupa, so coastal burial grounds, so erosion of that. So you've got, for example, in Makatu, where my family is based, there was a storm surge a couple of years ago, which saw the kaiwi on a cliff actually be washed away, and the bones tumbled down, and so we had to obviously put a rahui, so a traditional sort of restriction on the area until we could gather all the kaiwi and have the bones reburied. And then you've got the more sort of intangible elements, so the traditional cultural practices, so the impact on our kaimoana, so our taonga species, so how we're harvesting or how we're able to collect and gather traditional fish and, plant and pipis and mussels and kina and all these things which, over the past, couple of decades we're seeing decreasing, and we're seeing changes in their behaviour and changes in how we're able to gather them, and when pahutakawa, so when these flowers are blooming, and all these different changes as well. And then also something I think we also very fundamentally recognise as Indigenous peoples is the impact coming off colonisation. So, it's just a continuation of impacts we've already faced from land alienation and sort of, change, land use management changes and things like that. So it manifests in different ways. It manifests in different sort of time frames, at different intensities. And so sometimes it's very difficult to begin to understand, what is caused by climate change and then what is something which is just sort of a continuation of processes which have already occurred over the past 100 or 200 years as a cause of colonization. So yeah, I mean, I'll leave it there. I'm sure other people have some responses that can build from that.
Thank you, Sarah. And I'll be back to you a bit later with some other questions. So can I turn now to perhaps Elizabeth as another Pacific person? Shall I repeat those questions as well? So what do you see happening to heritage as a consequence of climate change? Where and how are you seeing change in heritage? And how do you understand heritage loss and damage?
I think I'll speak on a research that I did with the International Research Centre. This was straight after Cyclone Winston. That was a disaster that was experienced by Fiji on a scale never imagined. It was a total combination of tsunami, flooding, strong winds, and even death. So part of that research, we chose 2 villages, Nauthanbao and Namarai. Nauthanbao had no houses left. They were all wiped out. One thing the chief told me when I was interviewing him, he said, "Lizzie, look outside. You see all those animals, the chickens, the hens, the dogs, they all disappeared hours before the cyclone struck." So that is why I think I'm emphasizing here today is the importance of ICH. The indicators in nature, they all disappeared. They went up into the mountains. They hid in the mountains. After 3 days of the impacts of Cyclone Winston, they all marched down from the hill. Even the sharks were coming out from the oceans, dropping in their eggs in the rivers, and then going back out again. So imagine nature, animals, and human beings. We all talk and speak the same language. So then I had to interview about 30 people, all different age groups. And I found out with the elderly women, they knew how to, the indicators in nature, even how to save the breadfruits. They had to dig the soil, store them underneath there, and then after a few days, they dig it back out to eat. Because you know what happens during a cyclone, everything is wiped out. And when I asked the younger generation, do you know the practices of our ancestors? They're like, oh no, we don't know anything about that. So what we found out from that research is there are gaps, big gaps, and I hope that after this meeting we can come together to a conclusion or somewhat way to fill these gaps. These gaps need to be bridged. If we can save a life, if we can save a community, then I think we're doing it justice. Naka.
So thank you. Indigenous knowledge. Chrissy, would you like to comment?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for the responses so far. I can confidently talk about what is happening on the reef, as that is over my traditional seas, and also within the wet tropics. So in both areas, and quite a number of the communities have developed their seasonal calendars. So it's not a season of 4 seasons, and sometimes it's not even a season of 6 seasons. But so they've gone to, I know one community's actually gone to month by month, and they have a monitoring system whereby they work with the school kids, and they're called junior rangers. And so these junior rangers, they get activities to go out and observe things on country. And so they'll come back and they'll write it in the calendar. But over a period of 3 years now that have been to this community a number of times. They've actually had to move when a tree might be flowering further and further down. So, sort of, it's not in January anymore. It might be March. And that is dependent on a whole number of things because, sort of, if a particular tree flowers, you can be pretty sure that the mullet are going to run. Mullet is a fish that is really in abundance. And so that's when the people go out and get their fish. But if it doesn't happen, if that tree doesn't flower in the month that it was supposed to or it was indicated, a year or two ago that that's the month that the tree flowers and therefore, that's their time to go and get the fish, they've just got to keep observing and making sure that they're monitoring when does that tree flower. It used to be January, now it's March. And so it's a changing season and the seasons are getting warmer and warmer and warmer. I'm not going to go into coral bleaching or anything like that. That's not my area. But, sort of not only are the scientists and that, concerned about coral bleaching because the waters warm up so much and the heat comes down onto the water, it also affects the fish and, sort of the marine life. So that impacts on traditional owners that live up and down the reef, particularly in the remoter areas because they don't have a supermarket. They have to go out and catch their fish and catch their, meals and that. So, it impacts on them if they don't have the capacity to be able to go out and catch that fish at that certain time because, so they're really concerned about the fish are moving further down south. Sort of my husband comes from Tasmania and I lived in Tasmania for a while. They are getting fish in Tasmania that was only ever up in the warmer waters of the tropics. So the fish are moving down south and so that means these remote communities up in Cape York and they're miles and miles from anywhere, and they, sort of there to buy, a bit of mince even is really, really expensive and they've got to feed their families. And if they can't, that's too expensive and they can't get the natural foods that they're used to, and that because they're just not there, what happens, So it's impacting on communities, on their families and on their way of life and their traditional practices. And again, it brings in that traditional knowledge because they knew that, sort of these things are moving. So if they don't keep that seasonal calendar updated every few years, well then, sort of they're going to be behind the 8 ball because, it's moved from March now, we're moving down, sort of. So it's something that they have to keep monitoring all the time. And so they do that through different programs that is done through Gurumpa, which is the Reef Marine Park Authority. And it allows traditional owners to have what's called a TUMRA. A TUMRA is a Traditional Resource Use Management Authority. So that allows them to do things sustainably to make sure that there are still species and still numbers there for future generations. So our traditional foods are turtle and dugong, for instance, from the Torres Strait right down to central Queensland. And the size of the reef is the size of Italy. It's as long as Italy. And people don't really absorb that it's, that big. So, the difference of the TUMRAs and that, or not the difference, but the purpose of the TUMRA is for communities to actually make that agreement with the Marine Park Authority that they will only take a certain number of species. So instead of having turtle as their main food or even some fish, because some of them are now banned from, sort of being caught for in a commercial sense or in large numbers, or a dugong or two, they have to make a decision that we will only take one per year for a ceremonial purpose. And that might be, something of a very important elder has passed away and they have to have ceremony after that. So, they're restricted from their normal practices in that way as well, but they believe that they are contributing to the proper management and conservation of the reef, not only the reef, but the species that live on the reef as well. So, yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you. And Karen, would you like to comment on that? So we're looking at the what's happening to heritage as a consequence of climate change.
There's lots of impacts on different aspects of cultural heritage, impacts on sites, including art sites and sacred places, changes in the weather leading to increased pests and weeds, for example, and also with fire, like increased intensity of fire, the risk of destroying those sites. There's totemic effects on totemic species. I was talking to Chrissy in the lunch break about climate change meaning loss of habitat. So for example, Chrissy was talking about animals and plants that can only live at a certain elevation, and because of the temperature there and the humidity and everything there, and as that's changing, because the climate is changing, those animals and plants aren't able to live in those areas anymore. Also, loss of materials, like when I was talking in the presentation about using lignum grasses for weaving, and so because they're impacted by less water and impacted by the weather. And finally, in terms of cultural practices, the weather, meaning that traditional owners can't always return to country because it's too hot or too humid or whatever, and so not being able to do their cultural practices that they would have been able to before. And also, as Jason was talking about in the video, because of loss of animals and plants that can actually be hunted or collected. So there's a whole range of impacts.
Thank you very much. So I move now to the second question that I have, and perhaps I'll go first to Sarah, just to give her warning, and I'll read it out, and then to Malia. So, what is being lost to heritage as climate change develops? Or can you share examples of how Indigenous knowledge systems are part of adapting to or mitigating climate change? How is Indigenous heritage and knowledge systems part of climate action? Sarah.
Sure, yeah. I think a lot, all of us have spoken so far, I think, addressed, what is being lost. You've got the physical sites and you've got the intangible heritage, such as the cultural practices, and I think also the ability as sort of species move, sort of these traditional environmental indicators. Some are changing, some are needing to change because we've got different patterns with weather, we've got different patterns with flowering and how species are moving and things like that. And there's still a lot that can be drawn from Indigenous knowledge systems in terms of helping to create mitigation, sort of adaptation planning, and you see increasingly sort of on the international stage, particularly discussions between IPCC, UNESCO, ICOMOS about the use of traditional knowledge in these spaces. And just to speak from Aotearoa, we, along with many other sort of traditional communities, have a lot of information, sort of encoded environmental information in oral sort of traditions and whakatauki, so proverbs, karakia, stories that have been passed on, the maramataka, our calendar as well, which have in it sort of lessons that have been passed on from generations in terms of what we can pick up. And an example of this is sort of not from my own iwi, but actually work which was done by Dan Hikuroa, who is a sort of a earth scientist, an incredible Māori scientist in New Zealand, who was looking at the what happened at Maratā, which is a Eastern Bay of Plenty town. So just to give a little backdrop to that, it was completely sort of inundated from sort of flooding and a series of storms and things like that, which meant that they looked at or had been looking at moving the town away, sort of with different sort of successes and level of efficiency. But he uncovered sort of whakatauki, so a proverb about a taniwha, and the taniwha in New Zealand is sort of a kaitiaki, so it's a guardian, but it's also one of warning. So he found a whakatauki about how this taniwha was in the river, and the tail of the taniwha, which flicked from side to side, was sort of a warning about this area was prone to flooding. So the local marae, there was about 4 local marae that took heed of this whakatauki and didn't build their marae around the flicking tail, because that was where a lot of flooding was occurring. And so when these storms were occurring at Maratā, these 4 marae were actually pretty much unscathed because they heeded the warning of the whakatauki. And there's lots of examples about, going through and looking and going to our kaumātua, our kui, our elders, and seeing what, oral traditions have been picked up from their ancestors and what can be found out. And I know NIWA, so our National Institute of Water and Atmosphere, has Darren King has been going around sort of documenting these traditional indicators for weather as well, so environmental tohu, so going around and seeing, what's changed with them, because some of them have had to change, what can still be used. And so, I think there's still a huge amount of information that can be gathered from these oral traditions and these stories, but also with a lot of acknowledgement of what's changed, but also a lot can be learnt from what has changed and sort of what has shifted, and that allows us to better, adapt, because we're understanding that there's been changes between what has been passed on and then what's the reality now. And so, that's just a few examples from Aotearoa I can think of.
Thank you. And the examples of the proverbs that you're giving us, passing on, are all context related. So moving to an entirely different context, I pass the mic back to Maina. And what do you have to share, or what would you wish to share with us?
Thank you for the opportunity to engage again in this panel discussion. As I mentioned earlier in my presentation, one of the significant problems that we are facing, if we consider that as part of the non-economic loss and damage, I would say that, is basically our ancestral sites, the graveyards, that we have that strong attachment to. The picture that I showed earlier on was something that is a testament to those who have gone before us, the families of those who are still remaining in Tuvalu. They were so devastated out of that event that took place in 2015. Another impact that we continuously being disturbed by climate change was, in fact, that some of our cultural traditional wisdom of fishing, for example. If you go down to the beach in Tuvalu, you will, or in any other parts of the Pacific countries, you will get to see those what you call mud crabs in the sandy beaches. If you see those crabs building their house next to their hole, it indicates that it's not a good time to go fishing. If you go down to the beach and you see those mud crabs are playing around, it indicates that it's a good time to go fishing. But because of the change of weather patterns and, it increased the intensity of hot days in the islands, and it really sometimes it's tricky. That's why I said earlier to you, Elizabeth, although we still bounce back to rely on our traditional knowledge and the wisdom that has been passed on from our elders, but sometimes it's tricky because of the weather patterns, the change of the climate, and so. But those are some of the non-economic loss and damage, something that we cannot put a price tag onto it, and irreversible for us. Those are the only two examples that I can think of, but there are quite a lot for us living in the islands. Our traditional knowledge and system has been challenged by and disturbed by climate change.
Thank you. So the natural signs are telling us that things are changing, that we must be beware, think about what that means, monitor very carefully. Elizabeth, what about the signs that you might be aware of, or the damage to heritage from climate change and climate action?
Yeah, we've had a few villages back at home that have relocated. It wasn't easy. It took a long tug of war with government and the communities themselves. There was a lot of loss in heritage culture, their knowledge, and also, like my colleague mentioned, the connection to their burial grounds and ancestors. But some have actually relocated and done that move because, the waves are actually coming into the villages. They cannot avoid that. Going back to the story that I shared earlier, what we saw is that communities are so dependent. Some communities are so dependent on government handouts to assist them in building their homes. But then what we saw with the traditional knowledge and practices, we need to also empower and teach our communities that you need to take ownership. It's like our ancestors did. They just went back into the woods, into their gardens, bought their leaves, and came and did their little bures. So I think that's another practice for us back at home, that knowledge is lost. It's eroding, but then you have tribes and clans that if you are born into that tribe, you've got that gift. You're a builder. You don't have to get a certified education or a certificate for that. It comes naturally. So we have the fisherman tribe. I come from the warrior tribe. My grandmother's from the chiefly tribe of Samoa. So we have all these tribes. These are, maybe the terminology in the Western world would be mechanisms or something that you learned. But imagine for us, the indigenous people, you're born into that. And just like what you witnessed today, we are natural choreographers, dancers, and it comes naturally. So I hope for our Western brothers and sisters that are here, that understanding, is clear for us. Naka.
And Karen, if I contrast the Western understanding, or
Sorry,
not,
what was that?
what is your understanding of that?
It's interesting, I'm sitting here listening and thinking that we risk a lot by not listening to traditional knowledge and about cultural practices. One example that I talked about earlier was cultural burning and how that can teach us about caring for country and preventing the terrible bushfires that we've experienced recently. But also I was thinking of a story that I heard when I was working with the Arakwal people up in Byron Bay, and how all these rich people were moved into the area and wanted to build on Belongil Beach, and they were telling them that the coastline there changes constantly and just don't do it. And they didn't listen, and they've been arguing for seawalls and all these really expensive things ever since. And so I think that it's not that there's not the knowledge there. It's about white people are listening and actually valuing that knowledge, and that we can learn a lot and prevent a lot.
Thank you. And Chrissy?
Thank you. I might just build on the fire management stuff. As you all know, and those from overseas, we had a really big fire in, a few years just before COVID, I think it was. But for a long time, traditional owners have been telling the governments, state and territory governments, about, sort of burning doing cool burnings. They're called cool burnings. So they're not going to roar up into the tops of the canopy of the tree. And so this is how they practice, sort of safe burning, if you like, and to just clean the floor of the bush or the forest so that it doesn't turn into a raw raging fire that is reaching up into the canopies. It was quite horrific, sort of for a lot of people. We lost, so much ground, so much houses and that sort of thing. And it came, sort of over to where I was living actually, in Tumut up in the Snowy Mountains. So it sort of burnt all the way through there. It started in central Queensland and it went right down to Victoria, so that's nearly the whole length of Australia. And it impacted not only on people, but on the animals and the wildlife and that sort of thing as well. And that's why, sort of I did mention before, earlier today about totemic species and how, sort of a lot of them have been lost or they're endangered or they're threatened. Their habitat is gone, and so, sort of that puts them in the threatened basket. But also that, sort of by losing your totem, you are losing part of your cultural identity because you can't just go out and get another totem. Sort of I have heard that some communities have said, sort of, well, what do we do now? Do we go and find another one that we want to, but it doesn't work like that. It's a birthright that has come to you when you're born into a particular tribe or clan. And so, sort of the impacts are ongoing, not only nature, not only, sort of animal species, it comes to the people, but it keeps going because of the cultural connection that people have to country. And if it's, if that sort of thing is being ignored, they're never going to, sort of improve the situation or, sort of have better practices. Well, since that fire, a lot of farmers, not so much government yet, I think they're still working on it, but farmers have asked Aboriginal people to actually go and teach them about cool burnings. And mainly, sort of, and Tasmania is an island off the coast of Australia down south. Fires went through there a few years ago as well, and I know there were Tasmanians there, farmers that are really calling out for the Aboriginal people to come and teach them about patch burning or cool burnings. And that's not burning the whole thing, it's just burning a bit here and a bit there on certain days when there's no wind and it's a nice cool day, it's not hot, so roaring fire. So I think the fact that, sort of these practices have been around a really long time. And at one stage, in the far north, what we call the top end, which is right across the top end of Australia, they do a lot of burning. And at one stage, the governments wanted to, the Northern Territory government was saying, no, it's of no benefit to the environment, and, sort of it's a health hazard because it does, sort of, they pick their times and they pick it right. So through the places like Kakadu National Park, Arnhem Land, Litchfield, the big national parks up there in the Northern Territory, and that's a big space. You know, they argued that it does do some good, it does do the environment good, it does do the animals good. And, you know, so it just keeps the whole place at a level where it can be managed if there is a fire that breaks out. So it's not such a large fire then that goes across a big area. But I think, you know, if we try and tell scientists when they want to work with traditional owners that Indigenous knowledge is a science. So we stress that, you know, sort of by combining both the knowledge of traditional owners and the Western science, you get a far better outcome of looking at it from both angles, and you get a broader perspective of what the issue is and how, you know, sort of some changes can be put into place that is going to make it easier and happier and healthier for everybody, including the animals. We lost so many koalas. For those international visitors, that's one of our icons, but they're now on the endangered list. And, you know, so to just lose an icon through, you know, sort of fires like that, they can't run very fast. They're up the top of the tree where the fire comes up to the canopy. So, yeah, it's a real shame, and now they're putting a lot of effort into, you know, sort of trying to restore and revive the numbers of the koala. Thanks.
So, thank you. Traditional and Indigenous management practices, which may be even more useful in the face of changing climate. And that is not on my list of questions, so I think I might throw this open to others who might participate in that question as well. Is there anybody who would like to comment on that? No. Mike, we'll come to you.
Good afternoon, and thanks for welcoming me late. My name is Richard Mackay. I'd just like to ask Chrissy in relation to her last intervention, and I do that. Chrissy and I were talking about the use of cool burning back in 2011, I think, for the Commonwealth State of Environment report. But I mean, in the Greater Blue Mountains, which a number of the delegates will visit next week, there is large-scale management burning happening. It happens very much at the instigation of the Park Service, and I'm just interested in your thoughts about transmission of technique and cultural practices across the continents between the mobs, given that some of that knowledge is no longer current, you know, at this end of the continent.
There's an organisation called Fire Sticks. They had a big conference in Cairns just last week. So they are spreading the word. More and more, even traditional owners, Indigenous peoples, are asking for information and training and, you know, sort of how to do that safely, particularly down in the southern states such as New South Wales and Victoria. And ACT, because they haven't been practising at that. You know, those practices stopped a long time ago. But the man that actually started it learnt all of this as a young man himself up in the Cape York, Victor Stephenson. So he learnt from an old man, and he's been taking that same message to you know, traditional owners or anybody who wants to learn how to do cool burnings. And he was also one of the people that was involved in doing the slow burns and that for the farmers in Tasmania, because the farms there were quite large, particularly down the Midlands, down the middle of Tasmania. So, yeah.
Thank you. I can now reverse the practice and ask, oh, sorry, is there somebody? Yeah.
Oh, thank you very much, and thank you for the fabulous, informative talks that you all gave. Look, I've got two things to say. I hope it's okay to have two, goes at it. One of them is a comment and the other one is a question. So I'll start with a comment, which I'd like to ask if there's further comment too, because it's a gross simplification. My observation from the little that I've learned so far is that it is not enough for us to learn from nature, as important as it is, but there's a fundamental difference, and it addresses some of the things that were talked about this morning about Europeans wanting to reconnect with nature. But what I find is that from all the indigenous cultures around the world, notwithstanding the differences in the outward expression of that culture, there's a fundamental philosophy and attitude, which is that you look after the earth and the earth looks after you. Whereas the fundamental Western view and the industrial view is you look at the earth and you study it to see what can you get from it. And that's a very different kind of relationship. So it's not enough to relate better between man and nature, but one needs to have this attitude shift, that underneath all of these different cultures and philosophies that people have throughout the world, it's that fundamental question of what can we do actually? What does the earth want? What does the earth want us to do? And that's the question that is often not asked. In our Western system, where we have environmental impact statements, it's all about, well, environmental impact. In other words, what have we done to it? Not, and what have we taken from it, and what can we mitigate? It's not, what can we actually do to make it better? What can we do for its own sake to make it better? So that's my first, I guess, comment come question, which I'm happy if you can elaborate on it to see whether my oversimplification of these views are in fact valid or not. The other is a question, and that is that practically all of the indigenous cultures in the world have been around for much longer than recorded European or Asian history. Now, we've gone through in humanity a number of climate changes, all right, which were not human-induced. And is there anything from the traditions, the stories, from your cultures that come back to the present that talk about how those climate change events have occurred and what might have, then come through as stories from that, from which we can learn today?
I think you have made a very a valid point, especially when we talk about our relationship with nature and the environment. But let me also point it out a platform that was created under the UNFCCC, where we can share our stories and share our ideas, which is called the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform. I think that's the only platform within the UNFCCC that we can bring our own stories, our own traditional knowledge and wisdom, where we can share and also revisit some of the lessons that we learned from the past. So the reason why I'm mentioning this is the fact that we are not just building our way forward, but we are also looking backward and see what are the traditional knowledge that can be used to navigate our way forward. Like say for example, in Tuvalu, there is a traditional practice called the Panakua. It's where when there is drought on a specific island in Tuvalu called New Tao, there's a special family with this Panakua, with the it's kind of exactly the same with what do you call that that gift? Yeah. So that the lady will dance with this to the sky and chanting, and it will make the rain to fall. They will rainmaker kind of techniques, but it's only specific for that particular family in Tuvalu. So during the bushfire in Australia, I was here in Australia, and there was a big discussion around having that lady, that Panakua thing, to fly over and start dancing for the rain to fall. And we were condemned by most of the Christians in Tuvalu, saying that we are taking us back to our deities, and and that's part of our pagan worshipping. But for me, it's not about pagan worshipping. It's about how we revisit our traditional way of doing things. So that's why I'm mentioning the LCIPP under the UNFCCC, because it's important that we don't just hold on or confine our own stories to our own selves, but we need to bring them to the international community and share with other indigenous communities around the world. Say, for example, my sister here was talking about relocation of communities, Wunidongoloa in Fiji. And we had this long discussion and debate. There were a few professors from Australia who came over to strategize our migration framework in Fiji. I raised the question, why we have to talk about Wunidongoloa, these communities that have been relocated, and they are not here. And we are here in Fiji talking about their fate, talking about the future of the Wunidongoloa communities and other communities. But they're just around the corner. We never get them to be invited to come and speak for their own selves. But that's something that we should also look into when we discuss traditional knowledge. And then here we are trying to speak on behalf of other peoples that have that knowledge. I think most of the time we need to acknowledge that we are speaking on behalf of traditional knowledge holder. That's important.
Thank you. Yes, we have a saying, about them, without them. Elizabeth, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I'd just like to add to the discussion. I think climate change is a very important issue today, not only for us here in this forum, but even for the children back in schools. And I think this topic, this subject needs to go into those spaces where our children, right from the primary or preschool level, they need to be taught. They need, that's what we found in our research. Those that are living in the rural areas know the indicators, whereas those that are in the urban do not know. But guess what? If we created tools or books or apps or digital content, of course they will learn it. And we need to get into those spaces, even these digital spaces. And one thing I've seen now is that we need, no offense to the old school, but we need to move to the new school. We need to get into those spaces. We need to create the content, and we need to get the message out. And I know it's good to have these little forums and where you put in your stories, but what about those that don't know the story? What about those that would like to know the story? So we are the custodians of today, and they are the future of tomorrow. So it's our duty to get that message out and to transmit that knowledge. Naka.
Thank you. So you were talking about voices, but I've got another voice who wants to comment as well. Chrissy.
Thanks. I just wanted to build on that because I suppose in Australia we're lucky because we had a lot of studies done on Aboriginal people, linguists, recording our languages and that sort of thing. So the people on the east coast of Australia sort of lost their language and lost a lot of practices first before the rest of Australia. But if you have a look at probably the last 20 years or so, a number of those communities are reviving and surviving their languages now. But they could only do that by going to what we have here, a peak body, the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. So they have over 5 million objects or records or, things that have been stored in the Institute. And a lot of that is around languages from linguists, and they deposited their journals into IATAs. And so that allows communities to actually get information back about some of their practices and certainly their languages that they didn't know about, and they weren't doing, that because it wasn't passed down to them. So it's the opportunity for them to actually get that information from linguists who had, what did you call them in those days, 8mm videos or something, sort of film, and they were able to hear some of their language. So it's really important, that reviving and surviving. So, and then they formed their own, developed their own dictionaries, and now they're teaching it in schools, and they're teaching, sort of Aboriginal languages to primary kids. Black or white, didn't matter. You're in the primary school, you'll learn a language. And we're not learning English, German or French or, all those things that we went through when we were in school. We're learning, or the kids are learning, Indigenous languages in the area of where they live. So that's been, I suppose, part of the benefit of having, all of these studies done on us. And we used to say we're the most studied people in the world, sort of because of all the work, the researchers and linguists and everybody coming out to study how we live, what we did, sort of where our country is, how we spoke, all of that. And now the communities are pulling that back for their own use and for their own survival.
Thank you. We're taking a slightly different tack. And this is a question that participants might want to answer as well, as a forewarning. Within conversations about climate change and heritage, what voices are missing? And are they missing at the international, national, or local level? Does anybody have thoughts on that, about how we might elevate those missing voices? Any participants? Chrissy will answer.
I'll start it off. What voices are missing? Quite often it's the traditional owners themselves, because they're not consulted about different projects, about different things that's happening on their country, about different things that involves them or impacts on them. They don't, whoever it may be, whether it be an industry, whether it be researchers or whether it be a government, they don't always do that consultation properly. So I think, by following the proper way of doing consultation, and that's by looking at, sort of what the people need, not what the researcher needs. It might not be a priority for them. So it's also looking at, getting their consent to take that information and write it up and sort of have an agreement in place about how they're going to do that, what are they going to share, what are they using it for, all of those things. So I think it's sometimes the voice of the Indigenous peoples and traditional owners themselves that is missing from this whole picture when it comes to where they are not consulted in the first place and right from the very beginning.
Thank you. Yes, please go. Karen.
I just wanted to add to that too, that it's really important that we consider intellectual property, Indigenous cultural intellectual property in that as well. I think that's the other mistake that researchers have made, is that they just assume that they're going to be told the stories and that they can do what they want with them. That was just I wanted to add to that. And I think that we need, as white people, need to make sure that we do it properly and not just consider not only what is in it for us, but what's in it for them. And also that it takes time. Like, if we're really serious about hearing those voices, perhaps we have to build the relationships with those communities first and build the trust. Like, particularly, there's a lot of reasons that Indigenous people in Australia do not trust government, and so why would they want to talk to us? So so it's not only about hearing those voices, but having that understanding about that lack of trust.
Thank you. And I wonder, Sarah, do you have any thoughts on that question? Whose voices are missing in this discussion about climate change and heritage.
Sure. I mean, I think I'll build on what Elizabeth was saying about the youth. I think the young people are definitely, as the ones who are going to be inheriting sort of the repercussions of climate change, there are present sort of repercussions we're already facing, but the big bulk of it is going to be our children, our grandchildren, their children. So I think, what I found through my own research was the lack of sort of platform or facilitating engagement with the youth. And we already know throughout, the Pacific, across Aotearoa as well, there's a really strong youth voice coming up through, the Pacific Climate Warriors, through all of these school-based kind of calls for change, and so that transformation shift. I think there's a real hunger and a real desire to engage in this space. And so, Elizabeth talked about going into schools and providing the ability to, learn traditional practices and learn about what climate change is. And so I think climate literacy as well, like the ability to provide the tools and the awareness for our, younger generation to be able to understand what climate change is, but also how we can apply our own, traditional knowledge, our own cultural backgrounds, our own cultural identities in this space, so that when they go into, high school and into universities, they're better equipped to navigate the government, the climate governance space. They're better equipped to be able to know how to apply, there's a lovely saying, two-eyed seeing, using that traditional knowledge entwined or braided with, sort of climate science and climate governance. So, yeah, I think there's a lot more that needs to be done to bring youth to the table and to allow them to have a voice and to have a way of acknowledging that they're going to be the ones that are going to be impacted in the next 10, 15, 20 years. So, yeah.
And thank you. I think we had one of the, yes, you please. Now, have you got a mic? Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Tracy Whittaker. I just wanted to, I guess, add further to Aunty Chrissy and also to Karen's comments about the grassroots people having a say and being consulted, and it was time. Usually you get these government people who come in and they'll want you to answer, within a couple of days, and it's not how we operate. We all live all over the different parts of the state and of the nation. And when we have to consult our mobs, we have to get time to get together to talk about those things. And we often find that researchers and government people who come in want that answer now. And you just can't do that. And they shouldn't be asking us to do that, because they've been looking at this thing for, a year or so before they come out to us. And it should be, from the first instance, they have an idea, it should be consultation straight up, because we could be steering them in a better direction. And also we were having a discussion at lunch, and it sort of goes something to what I guess this gentleman was saying about not knowing about what's happening in different worlds as well. I think even nationally, my cousin went to COP27 and he didn't understand, like we're the desert mob, he didn't understand what was happening in Tuvalu. And I don't know if you were there as well at that one in Egypt. Yeah, you probably spoke to my cousin Joshua, and he was horrified to find that a lot of the Pacific Islanders hate Australians because Australian government doesn't help them as much. And I don't think that news is not actually getting to us properly. From a news perspective, it's not getting us to us about what you guys are actually facing.
Thank you. So more communication, Elizabeth.
Yeah, sorry, can I just add again to Sarah? Speaking on the youth, yes, that's very important, but I think it's also important how we are communicating this message out. The platforms we are using, I'm sure nobody in this room knows does not know what is TikTok or Facebook. So we need to be in those spaces. And a good example was during COVID. Look at that. Everybody was on the digital space. And we had this bunch of islanders all over the world doing their makeup and then flipping it all around. It was going all around. So I was like, wow, imagine if we created like a ripple effect of that and just creating our own content. Naka.
Great idea. So is there anybody that has an unscripted question that would like to pose it now? Yes.
Thanks, everybody. My name's Erin. I've really enjoyed today's panel. Thank you. There was a comment earlier about policy windows, and there's been a few comments about things we've learnt, like the bushfires resulting in people wanting to learn about cultural burning. And I just wondered if each of the panel members had a window of opportunity that they could see now that we should be acting on.
Thank you. So what is the window of opportunity and how do we take advantage of that? Shall I throw that to Sarah first of all and then go Elizabeth and back this way? So Sarah, window of opportunity, do you see one?
Yeah, I do. I think now New Zealand's been quite slow in moving, but now as the governments are beginning to develop sort of national adaptation planning, developing sort of, emissions reduction and sort of resilience planning, sort of now is the opportunity to sort of push forward sort of Indigenous knowledge and sort of consultation and sort of pushing forward grassroots engagement and things like that. It's when those big calls for public engagement. It's when those big calls for sort of public comment. Those are the sort of the times to really push forward Indigenous voices and really push for engagement with the local communities, because and oftentimes they're not very well advertised. So depending on your sort of iwi in New Zealand, some iwi are very much tapped into when the government's going to call for consultation, or when local governments or local councils are going to call for consultation. So, they're very aware of it, but there's a lot of smaller, sort of more rural, more coastal iwi, not even coastal, but even just within sort of the middle of New Zealand who aren't aware of these processes. So if you're in a position where you're involved with policy, if you're in a position involved in government, and you're non-Indigenous, one of the most important things to do is to provide information to these smaller communities about the process and what to do, because it's those consultation stages, it's those call for recommendations, call for comments. Those are going to be the ones that you actually begin to get those voices in, because we can sort of sit here and talk about let's involve Indigenous voices more often, and let's make sure that we're being consultated, but we also need to be able to know when and how to go to those spaces, those sort of policy engagement spaces and things like that. And yeah, that's an example. I mean, I know New Zealand's plan has been developing the National Adaptation Plan. They've been developing the action sort of packages over the past couple of years. And going forward, I know there's a lot more push from iwi to be in those spaces when those action plans are being developed and things like that, and sort of you need to be able to pull them in and pull them into the conversation as well. So that's an example I can think of.
Thank you. Elizabeth, the window of opportunity.
I'd share the same sentiments with Sarah. For us back at home, community consultations is very important. Not having that really top-down approach, but sometimes the communities themselves can help policymakers create and write the narrative according and which is most suitable to them. And what are the benefits do for them? I think the awareness needs to be brought out to the fore and to the core. And for myself, from my experience with my colleagues up there at Fiji Arts Council, we've actually had to go down to the communities, ask them what they needed. Some of them even needed cooking houses, like things like that for pottery or salt making. So these are the issues that they face. And sometimes they'll ask you, is it only to get your box ticked as a policy, but what's the benefit for us? So we need to highlight those issues and make it relatable, whether it's to climate change or what other policies at the table. Naka.
Thank you. Karen, do you see a window?
I was one that's talking about the policy window with the fires. I just was thinking about COVID, not only about us learning how to work online, but there was an incident, and I can't remember the whole story, about a town that was cut off with a high Aboriginal population. I think it might have been Walgett, but please don't. It was Walgett, wasn't it? Yeah. And the Aboriginal people in Mutwinji were able to hunt and to actually take kangaroo to Walgett. They had to. It was all a bit fraught, apparently. They had to leave it outside the gates of the town and everything. But what it's made us in government look at is all of those regulations about hunting on park, and that and being able to work with traditional owners about, like, that even though there's supposed to be exceptions about things like hunting or collecting abalone for particular reasons and things like that, it's always been highly regulated, and so it's an opportunity for us to really look at what the purposes are and to make sure that we can make that happen again.
Thank you. And Mina, any windows to Balu?
Yes, I think one of the opportunities that we should look into, especially from a perspective of a community practitioner, is partnership. I think we should engage more in terms of having our communities back in the island have to develop partnership with other communities around the world, especially in terms of Indigenous knowledge, that we can create a platform so that we can share ideas and knowledge. A database will be another issue that we should also look into it, in terms of how can we document those ideas, document those traditional knowledge, and also in a way that we can share and learn from different Indigenous communities around the world. So I would prefer having that genuine partnership as a platform where we can engage with communities, especially on the of free, prior, informed consent, which is something that's always missing in terms of developing policies and stuff in the island. It always seems to be, when we talk about policies, it's only a government thing, something that is always stuck at that level of discussion. But it is important to incorporate the voices of communities, and that's why partnership is important for a way forward. Thank you.
Good. Thank you. And Chrissy?
Thanks, Erin. Good question. You might not like my answer, though. I've been fortunate or unfortunate, I don't know, to be, sort of attending quite a number of committees that deal with Indigenous heritage. The opportunity I see is that it all comes through, like, the Indigenous heritage processes, and starting with the Commonwealth piece of legislation, the review and all that sort of thing, coming out of the Department of Climate Change, Energy and the Environment and Water, which is your department. A lot of these committees are really doubling up in what they are doing within their own community. We've got, I could name, I've identified about 6 of them, and I've been invited to their different meetings, and I thought, hold on, we're already doing that in another department for repatriation. Yeah, we did that rock art scoping 20 years ago, and they want to do it all again. And so I think the opportunity that I see is collaboration and consistency, so that there is something that is, sort of a benefit to not only the department and staff, that, everybody's talking from the same page, but to the communities and the people who the legislation impacts on. And it is just like, and I won't even go there where there's all the different states and territories have got different pieces of legislation, and they're not consistent really either. I mean, look at WA, where they had to throw out that bill. I hadn't read the bill, but, they've gone back to the 1972 piece of legislation. So, some of our legislation is back in the 70s. I saw a slide somewhere, we're going back to the 80s. I don't know where that was now, but yesterday, yes. And, so it was, sort of even further back than that. But I think the opportunity is for, these bodies to get together to sort of, because every committee is saying, we need to do this and we need to go and see the minister. Well, you have half a dozen people or bodies going to the minister talking about the same thing. Didn't I just do something around that? Right up to funding programs, which is the latest grant program for Indigenous heritage to increase or ensure that your values are included in natural heritage list or World Heritage List. So I think there needs to be more coordination, cooperation from the bodies, the committees, for a start to come together, sort of collaboration and consistency, so that there might be a delegation of 6 people go to see the minister and bang, 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 she's got it all. Not one after the other, months apart and all that sort of thing. That's my view.
Thank you very much, and what a great question. No, we will have to have that conversation over afternoon tea. I just want to thank, before I hand over to Helen again, thank every single one of you for sharing your knowledge, for being frank, for your ideas, and yes, just for sharing so generously. So thank you, Elizabeth, Karen, Chrissy, Mina, and also Sarah Ferguson in New Zealand, who has a broken clavicle, I think, from memory. Thank you so much for being with us. And over to you, Helen. Oh, I also meant to say thank you so much, Asmita, for giving me the timing every 2 or 3 seconds. It was very valuable. Thanks, Helen.